Welcome to the Art of We podcast. Today we are talking about when and how to give an ultimatum, specifically in your partnership when you feel like there's no other hope than giving an ultimatum. And as you pointed out, Will, when we were talking about doing this episode, it is a expression of keeping to our agreement of being for each other's success. And we'll talk about how this relates to actually being for each other's success if it comes down to giving an ultimatum. But first, Will, let's dive into when we would give advice to somebody who's considering an ultimatum. Like when would we suggest that they actually give an ultimatum? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
It's a fun topic.
It's very, very light and cheerful.
Well, I think I remember reading in self-help books when I was younger that you never give an ultimatum in a relationship. And then I came to a point in my first marriage where giving an ultimatum was the only thing left, that the only choice I could make after trying to get my wife's attention in a lot of different other ways. So I have some things to say about how that went and why I'm happy that I did that.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it's a little bit of a Hail Mary. It's a little bit of a last resort in a relationship. It's kind of ironic because we just finished talking about in a previous episode about not threatening the relationship when you're fighting with your partner.
Right. And in that episode that you're talking about, we're talking about not giving impulsive threats to the relationship. And what we're talking about here is really about deeply thinking and considering about giving an ultimatum before it's done. And it sounds like when you gave the ultimatum in your marriage, it was basically a last resort, like you said. So for anybody who's listening, it could be a last resort. It could be you guys have tried a gazillion things and you're banging your head against the wall. It could be that you've worked really hard and you're still not having a relationship that is successful and you're able to identify why, but that doesn't seem like it can move forward. What else would you add to that?
I think it can also be an expression of changes in priorities and needs over time. Couples in long-term relationships can experience that. It can be really tricky territory to navigate. The ability to stand up for your needs that aren't getting met is a critical relational development. So it can be a really empowering experience if it's not impulsive, if it's not emotionally driven by a desire to not feel something that you actually need to feel. So
like for example, like a lot of grief and sadness that you're not getting a particular need met inside of your partnership with this partner, like to actually feel that grief and that loss rather than coming from reaction and anger, for example. Is that what you're talking about?
I think I'm talking about the difference between looking at your partner. I think you're right. I think it's something in the neighborhood of using ultimatums to really drive change that's going to support both people to be more expressed inside their own lives, as opposed to using an ultimatum. Let's say, for example, in the heat of the moment when maybe your ego is hurt by something your partner said.
So maybe we can think of a couple examples. I'm thinking of, let's say one partner has been reliant or using different kinds of drugs, for example, to check out or that they're addicted to. And you guys have been working on that for years or months or however long, your own tolerance is. And things keep getting stuck and your partner keeps getting back into the addiction, no matter how much support, help. You guys have tried everything. And you're like, I can't be in this kind of like, this isn't actually good for me to be inside of this partnership. And I know I'm starting to feel like I'm not being able to get my needs met here by having a sober partner. Like that would be an example.
That's a great example where you might take a stand for yourself and say, look, I'm not willing to spend the rest of my time in this conversation in partnership about whether my partner is sober or not, whether they're, on the fence or solid in their sobriety or not. I want to be in other conversations So I want to put that behind me.
Right. Right. So that would be a good example of like, okay, it's time to give an ultimatum. And we're going to talk about, how to give an ultimatum, how we would suggest you would do that. But maybe we talk a little bit about why this is being for each other's success. And if you've heard us before on this podcast and you've heard some of our episodes, you might know that we really believe in agreements for couples, relational agreements about how we're being together and why we're doing certain things together. Very explicit agreements. One of our agreements is being for each other's success, and that looks like a lot of different things. But basically, it's standing for our partner's greatest expression and supporting them to be able to thrive inside of that expression. And the reason why this agreement is related to giving ultimatums is because, do you want to take a stab at that first, Will?
Well, if we define the reason the couple exists is for both people to get their needs met fully and to be fully expressed in the world, then it becomes obvious to say that if one person's needs are not getting met consistently, then that relationship's going to feel like a failure or not be a success for them personally. Plus, if that agreement is held mutually, which hopefully it is, that we're both here to support each other to, feel good in this relationship and express ourselves fully, they're also experiencing failure if they're not being fully supported in the full range of their expression and their behavior in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, you and I have talked about the idea that if you're in a company and you're for your employees' greatest success, you might fire that person because they're not a good fit for their role in fulfilling the same commitment of being for their success. So it's a similar situation.
Right. And just to give credit to the collaborative way, this is where we really learned about this framework of what it means to be for each other's success. And when we would take it into companies, it was very confusing for people of being like, what do you mean firing somebody is being for their success? And it's like, yeah, they're not surviving here. They're not thriving here. They're not able to do their job. So how are we being for their success if we're letting them stick around? And it's kind of a similar viewpoint that you can take on if you're with a partner who's failing to be successful with you inside of your partnership. So thanks for bringing that up. I'd love to hear, Will, about your journey, a little bit about your journey of giving an ultimatum in your previous marriage and to get a little bit of an example of what this has looked like. I've never given an ultimatum before, but I love that you've had this experience and it seemed like it was very successful. At least here we are today together married, which I would consider that a success.
Well, our relationship, I think, in some ways, is a fruition of that ultimatum that I gave in, let's see, when was that? December of 2016. And I just need to give a little context. I had been at that point married for 19 years or something like that. And we were in a lot of struggle about whether, to put it simply, whether we were not only responsible for our own individual needs, but also responsible for each other's needs and fulfillment. And I was more and more taking the position that it was both, that I wanted to be in a marriage where I was responsible for myself and responsible for her and vice versa. And we were struggling a lot about this perspective. And I felt like we were in silos and I wanted to be in a more secure, interdependent situation. So in September of that year, I started thinking about what would it mean to lay it all on the line and just say to my wife at some point, as I started to plan this idea and talk to my therapist about it and get reflection from my friends about it, the right situation to bring that up. And it felt like a very, the emotional experience I was having about needing to go to that length to take a stand for myself was very somber. It was like coming to the end of the road and having to make peace with the possibility that this could end the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent 3 months getting ready for that
Wow.
and practicing what I was going to say and getting super clear about what my language was going to be and what kind of setting I wanted to be in. And then the opportunity arose during a family vacation where we had been given a gift of a night away from the family in a nice hotel.
Mm.
And so it felt like the best opportunity I could imagine is to be in a peaceful environment without kids running around and without a lot of input from the outside, and an expansive time to hold the reaction that I expected to get
Mm-hmm.
with compassion and presence and, as much adult as I could bring. And so that's what I did. I said, here's what's happening. I'm giving you an ultimatum. I'm calling a spade a spade. Let's not pretend that this is anything else. And I wouldn't blame you if you walked away and said, I don't like ultimatums and I'm done today. This is it. I'm out of here.
What was the ultimatum that you gave her?
I said, I need you to commit with me to couple therapy as many hours as it takes to get to the bottom of whether this relationship is going to be viable for both of us, given the difference in how it seems like what we want.
So the request was really about both of you committing specific resources until it got figured out.
Yep.
Like it wasn't just like, oh, let's go to couples therapy a couple times. It was like, no, we're gonna keep going until like we have an answer to this. And how did she respond?
To her credit, initially there was some resistance, let's say, and then
That same night when you guys were together, or did it take a long time to get there?
I think it took about a day for her to say yes to that. Within a week, we had um, the first 10 hours of work scheduled. So it was it was a really powerful moment for me of standing up for what I really felt I needed going forward. Um, you know, to complete the story in a brief way, we spent several months, the better part of a year, undergoing an investigation in every way that we knew how of whether this relationship was viable or not. And we came to a mutual understanding by the end of that process that the relationship was over.
Mm.
And so I think if I hadn't made the ultimatum, we could have wandered in the half awake, desert of relationship for maybe decades without ever coming to the clarity that we got to in a matter of a few months.
So amazing and such a powerful story. And I'm so grateful that you decided to take that stand because, like you said, like potentially this relationship wouldn't exist if you had not stood for yourself in that way. You could still be there, and both of you
Yeah,
kind of, not happy, not ultimately happy. And fortunately,
right.
she's also seems to be very happy these days and
Yeah,
probably very grateful for you to have brought that.
right. It seems like we are living lives that are more aligned with who we are and what we want as a
Yeah,
result of that. So I'm proud of that result, even though it was a really daunting challenge to take.
definitely. And so, for those of you who are listening and you're in the question mark of, gosh, I feel like I do need to do something like this. I need to stand for myself. I feel like I need to have a conversation that has the ultimatum flavor to it. When we come back from the break, we will go through some steps that we've thought about and taken time about how we would approach ultimatums now at this point in our lives, and hopes that it would help you to find your way around that. Welcome back. Okay, so Will, in your story, you did share some ways that you prepared for that kind of conversation that you had with your previous wife. I'm curious if we just kind of start blank slate all over again, how you would approach prepping for an ultimatum for the person who's listening, who's like, I think I might need to have that conversation. How do I even prepare for that? I'm curious what steps you would suggest that they take.
Well, when you first get an idea that you may have to set in that first moment. There might be some emotional charge that, is would be expected to happen in that moment. Something just happened, and now you've got an idea about maybe I need to set an ultimatum. So I think the first step is to really slow down and make sure that the desire to, or the impulse to set an ultimatum is not coming from avoiding something.
Like avoiding your own, what, like discomfort or emotional triggers, or what would they be avoiding?
Well, I think that we have a reactive mind sometimes, especially when we're fighting with our partner. And there can be a desire to just get away from something that feels really painful.
I see. So getting away from your partner because it's so painful versus dealing with and being with what's arising, the pain and yeah.
For example, if I'm arguing with my partner who's addicted to, let's say, alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
and that's my perspective, right? That I think they're addicted to alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And they're telling me, blah, 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 some defensive stuff about their behavior. Um, a part of me might feel like I'm not worthy of love, let's say, right? If they really loved me, they would want to stop alcohol because they can see how harmful that is to our relationship and to me personally. Um, and so there could be like an impulse to get away from that
Right.
feeling of shame or worthlessness or something like that.
Right. And by just like slamming the door shut kind of
Yeah,
thing. Yeah. Got
exactly.
it. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that.
So I think that's the first step. And then the second step that I would recommend, based on my own experiences, talk about this confidentially with either a mentor or a friend who you can trust to really challenge you along the lines of what I just said. A friend who can say, look, it sounds like you really are avoiding X, Y, or Z, and that's why you want to do an ultimatum. And then really reflect on, is this going to be of service, the commitment to be for each other's success? In what way of me standing for my own needs and desires can that be helpful to my partner,
Mm-hmm.
even if it means the end of the relationship?
Right. And that can be really hard sometimes. Like I'm thinking of the partner who's super addicted. They can't or won't get the support that they need to get out of the addiction. And there could be a part of me that would be like, I'm leaving them to flail out in the world. How is this for their success in any form? But sometimes it takes the the greatest fear of somebody's life of like their partner leaving them to create some sort of change for themselves.
Right.
And other times, they're not going to make that choice, obviously, but it's not healthy to keep that burden on the partner who's not addicted to be holding. So I think that's such an important perspective to consider.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is something that keeps people in painful dynamics when there's a lot of fear that the person might, harm themselves or take their own lives, or, there's all kinds of things that people either subtly or not so subtly threaten, when when the relationship's on the line.
Totally.
It's a good one to keep in mind, is like who's ultimately responsible for that person's life, right?
Right. Right. And if you are in that situation, and you can't figure out like how to take the steps forward in standing for yourself because of that fear of your partner having some sort of self inflicted harm, I would personally go get one on one therapy with somebody who could really help me see through the maze of that. Because if you're just trying to do it by yourself and you're afraid for your partner's well-being, I think it's very hard to do and to get clarity and to take any action, honestly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a resource that some people don't hear about for some reason, but it's been around for a long time in parallel with Alcoholics Anonymous, called Al-Anon, which is a form. It's a format to help people who are in relationship with someone with an addiction to
Mm,
navigate the waters of how much help is too much help for the person with the addiction, how much support is too enabling or codependent to actually serve as support for the
Oh,
person
that's
with the
great.
addiction. So it's a good resource to know about.
That's great. We'll put it in the show notes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next step. Don't threaten to leave the relationship unless you're willing to keep the threat. So to keep the promise. This is something that's really important. It erodes your own, how much someone's going to respect you if you don't keep your word.
And like listen to you and actually believe it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There they go again. They're upset. They're not really going to leave. The last time they threatened, they didn't leave, and so they're not going to this time.
Yeah.
So respect yourself enough to follow through if that's what you're saying you're going to do, which is another reason why not to do it impulsively, because you might actually not want to leave the relationship at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay, so the next step is to plan what kind of setting do you have access to that would support an emotionally challenging conversation.
Kind of like where you with your previous partner was like, okay, we don't have the kids. It's just us one-on-one. We're not going to be distracted by anything that we're aware of. And planning consciously about for you and your partner, what would that look like? Okay, great.
I would say one more gut check. Do I really want to make an ultimatum? Because this could be irreversible, kind of like a nuclear weapon. You want to have checks and balances in place, triple check. And then I think getting really clear about what it is. What is the ultimatum specifically?
Right. Because if I had an addicted partner, if I said, you just need to stop drinking, there might be some obvious things that need to happen, like the partner needs to stop drinking, but it's not like by when, like, or how are we going to figure this out? Or are they replacing something else instead of drinking? Like, are they going to go to a different substance instead of drinking? Am I requesting that they go through an actual detox program? What is the actual request? Is that what you're
Right.
suggesting?
Great example. What does a sober lifestyle look like? People who struggle with addiction, when they lay down one thing, as you just said, it's common for them to take an addictive relationship with something new that might be better for them, but could also continue to erode the foundation of the relationship.
Yeah, I would imagine too, this is a really good time to sit down and do even deeper self reflection around, like, okay, let's say this person can get sober. Then what kind of partnership, like you were kind of saying, is really important to me to live into? Like, here's what I can imagine is possible, and include that into the ultimatum. So they're not like surprised, like, well, what do you mean I gave up drinking? And so now you're asking me to do all this other stuff. It's like, can you include the vision that you have for the partnership inside of that ultimatum? Or is that a step that you would suggest that is done later?
Great question. I think that my own experience is all I have to go on with that. I remember sharing with my now ex that I really needed and wanted and was committed to having, what you and I call a secure functioning adult partnership together. And I wasn't willing to settle for anything less than that. And that there was a picture being painted of what was possible in my mind, what I was committed to, where I was going with my life. And there was an invitation for her to be that person if she was up for it. My sense was that part of why we needed couple therapy was for her to get more familiar with what that meant, from someone beside myself, explaining to her what secure functioning really is.
My sense is that part of the key there was that you were already clear in your system that that is exactly what you wanted, versus being like, well, I hope to have this kind of partnership that's secure functioning. There's a very big difference in how the message is going to be communicated and also how you're going to act with your partner moving forward. Because it's like, this is the kind of partnership I'm going to be having. The question is it with you? Versus, if you stop XYZ, then I hope that we can have a relationship that looks like this. I really appreciate the clarity that you had and the stand that you had. And I hear that it took you 3 months to build up to have that conversation. And I want to invite the listener to take as much time as you need to actually get super clear within yourself, and also to prepare in the same way that you did, Will.
There's one more step here that I think is important that we haven't talked about yet, which is, okay, so you're telling me you're going to leave the relationship if this doesn't change. When are you going to leave the relationship? How much time do I have?
Right, exactly.
Before you leave?
Yeah.
For me, the answer was a year.
That night you gave her a year.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
And I felt good about that. It felt like, these are big changes that I thought needed to happen. And I didn't think it could happen in 3 months or 6 months. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to really find out once and for all, because I figured that if I needed to leave the relationship, with ultimately I did, I wanted to leave knowing that I'd tried everything I could try before leaving, because I didn't want to have any thought in my mind that I didn't give it a full go, especially with my daughter in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it turns out that you didn't need a full year. You guys got clear within about 9 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it was about 9 months.
Great. So then the next step is to have a conversation and request a conversation. So I would, Will and I talked about this before recording this, and we feel like the best approach is do something like Will did, where it's like, okay, here's the time. Here's a really good time, at least. I don't know if you did this in your conversation, Will, but I think it's really important to enroll your partner in the conversation, that they're willing to have the conversation rather than just bulldozing and saying, okay, surprise, I have a conversation that I want us to talk about, and here it is. It's more like, listen, partner, I want to have a really important conversation with you, and it's going to be potentially be challenging for us, and it's really important to me that we have that conversation. And I personally think that now is a good time to do that, assuming that you did your homework and you set up like this. We're not going to be distracted. We're going to have time together. And are you willing to engage in this conversation with me right now? And you're potentially going to get a lot of responses to that question. But if they are, that's awesome, because you want to get their permission to be in the conversation with you. And if they're not, then I think it's really important to say, okay, well, if you're not willing to do it right now, then let's put a date and time on the calendar and set a block for a certain amount of time, such that we're both willing to come back to this conversation. I think that both of those are very important.
I think that's a very generous way to do it.
Now, potentially, your partner could say, well, what do you want to talk about? And they could start to get activated or irritated or agitated already. And what I would suggest is, if there is activation or irritation in the system with either of you, that it's not the best time to approach it. You could say something like, well, I want to talk about this ongoing issue that we have, or I want to talk about this aspect that we've been struggle with and figure out a way through it. And I want to make sure that we're doing it when we're both regulated and we're both willing to get in there and care for each other's experience and find our way through this conversation. Would you agree, Will, that if there's any kind of activation that in the moment, that maybe it's better to schedule a time for a later?
Yeah, I think in the service of not activating the animal fight or flight, defense system, I think it's a great idea to have both people coming to it voluntarily, making the invitation. It's a different conversation if your partner stonewalls you or never comes back around to it or always makes excuses to avoid the conversation. And then,
right. Or they get into the conversation and they're defensive and can't collaborate with you, which might be the case. And then it's like, okay, the ultimatum might have to be delivered in another way where they can receive the communication, but it's not going to activate a massive rupture and massive fight between the two of you. Otherwise, you're just going to get back into the content that you're not making it through in the first place.
I think that's where, for me in my journey, it helped to rehearse me really owning my need and my desire, and to get really strong in my languaging of, this is what I need. This is what I want, not making it about, this person in front of me is doing it wrong, or their point of view is wrong, or
Mm-hmm.
they're wrong as a person. It's like I'm perceiving that there's a difference here in what I want and what you're committed to. And we need to talk about that.
I think that's so important. When I'm thinking of the addict partner, I could imagine saying something along the lines of, I really, really, really need to be in a partnership where I feel like there's safety, there's security, we have each other's backs, we can be on the same page. I want the kind of partnership where there's not this level of explosion when we're trying to talk about challenging things. And I feel like in order for us to move forward, we have to find a way to resolve this or be in a different conversation about what we each want in partnership. And personally, I've come to the conclusion that I have 6 more months in me to give this for us to figure this out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So not an easy conversation. So if you're listening to this and you're considering this, we send you a lot of love and compassion and encouragement to take your time and to really, really, really learn how to stand for yourself here.
Yeah, no, I'll just leave you with one more word on that. In that vein, which is, to really trust the journey of your life, that you can and will find the fulfillment that you want and need, and I would say deserve, in the fruition of the hard work of earning it, and not to be in doubt that the way you want to be in relationship is possible. That doubt can cause many years of mediocrity in your relational world. So the sooner you can step up to trust that, the better. And if you're like me, you need a lot of different kinds of supports to develop that strength and that trust and that confidence. So we're here for you, and we are rooting for you. And please reach out to us if you'd like to share any of your experiences in this realm.
I couldn't have said that better, and I echo you 150%. Thank you for saying that, Will. Yes, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for listening to the Art of We podcast. We'll talk to you next week.